Hi folks, you're with Tacitus today. In this video I'd like to talk about one of the most famous battles in certainly modern military history, the Battle of Gettysburg in the US Civil War in the 1860s. Now, Gettysburg was treated or was considered to be a turning point really in the Civil War, where the South had lost the military initiative and the North had gained it. And Gettysburg was considered to be a victory. I'd like to take a closer look and say that in fact it wasn't a victory. What it did achieve was it frustrated the aims, the political and military aims of the South, in terms of encouraging the North to just give up and accept that the South, the Confederacy, would be a separate sovereign entity, and the North, that didn't succeed. So it's perceived as frustrating the political and military aims of the South, and I would say it was no more than that. Was it a military victory? I don't think so. Now, let's just go a little bit of history here in the Civil War. Like most military conflicts, particularly ones that were as brutal as this, neither side believed that the military conflict would occur. There were some who did, but most people thought that as each little step sort of went along, as each little confrontation each side believed that the other one would back down, or somehow a compromise of some sort would be found, that the North would accept that the South would secede, and that they would become a separate entity to some extent, maybe not completely, but would be largely sovereign, and not part of the overall union. The North, or if you like, the federal government at the time, Abraham Lincoln, believed that somehow the compromise would involve keeping the Union together. So as each side sort of moved a little forward, step by step, and the temperatures began to rise, it wasn't really until fighting broke out really that people began to realise that this was going to turn into a conflict. Now, when you look at the first battle of the Bull Run, or Manassas as it's sometimes known, the casualties were small. There were two very amateurish groups sort of running around, and casualties were really minimal. Neither side could particularly claim a victory of any sort. And it was only at that point, or even then, many voices around were assuming that okay, we've had a bit of a skirmish, now we'll all sit down and talk about it and sort something out. But of course it escalated and went... Now, the war aims of the South, you've got sort of 1/3 of the population with really a minimal amount, maybe a fifth of the industrial capacity of the United States. So 1/3 of the population with minimal industrial capacity have turned against or are fighting with the other 2/3 that have 3/4 to 75 to 80% of the industrial capacity. So it's only going to end one way here, and unless the South achieve sort of very decisive lightning victories where they absolutely destroy the armies of the North and do that continue, it's unlikely that the North would see that they need to concede anything really. They've only got to outlast the other side, and this was the Confederates understood this. So they had to make the as they saw it, their war aims were to make the keeping of the Union so expensive and so filled with aggravation that the federal government, the Union, would just say, okay, look, you can have your separate entity, fine, just do it. This is all too hard. There's just too much drama here. We'll just give it to you. So their military aims were really to prevent the North from winning, or prevent the North, the Union armies from gaining any sort of serious dominance in the battlefield or anywhere for that matter. And in this regard, the South, given their particular aims, were quite successful. So that the North, and Abraham Lincoln was certainly part of this, was telling his generals, look, find their armies and destroy them. I don't want some draw or half-assed bullshit battle outcome here. I want victory. Destroy the Confederate armies. They have limited resources, so we've got the advantage in manpower and industrial output. So I want these armies. Now, it just so happened that of the top 10 generals in the United Battlefield Generals at the time, the South had well, back then, what, 8, even 9 of the top generals. So they had the better generals, better leadership, better organisation. Robert E. Lee was quite good and quite a daring general, really, as were others. Longstreet and so on. So the difference in the war aims are reflected in how the battles were interpreted. So that, again, the South just attempting to make it all so hard and so difficult and so expensive and so drama laden for the North that they would just have your separate country, have your separate sovereign entity, and the North attempting to fully destroy and put down what they perceived as simply a rebellion that had to be crushed. And these two different war aims, really played out in the type of battlefield tactics and the way forces were utilised and mobilised. Now, the war had gone on for a couple of years. The South was starting to realise that the harassment tactics weren't working as much as they'd figured it would. The North was really looking at, the government of Abraham Lincoln was looking at, this is a much tougher gig than we imagined, and we've got to dig in here. We've got to have conscription. We've got to ramp up industrial production, and we've got to just really outlast these guys, which was kind of how it was going. It was already kind of going that way. So the South was looking for a circuit breaker, and so they went into Pennsylvania, and they were roaming around there, spreading fear and revulsion in all directions, and they were moving towards what was going to become the Battle of Gettysburg. Now, the South was really quite a long way from their supply lines, and the North was quite close to theirs. And there was a decent amount of industry in and around that Pennsylvania area and nearby. So as the two sides sort of lumbered towards Gettysburg, each looking for the other, and the South was wanting to strike a decent blow, hurt the Northern Army. The Northern armies at the time were looking to or certainly at Lincoln's egging on, were looking for decisive victory. Gettysburg was neither. Neither side actually achieved their objectives here. And did the outcome of the battle justify its iconic status? Well, let's have a look. The North was superior in men and cavalry, and we're looking overall. The North had about 30% more men, give or take 30% more men than the Confederates did. So quite a decent, advance, 3-2 sort of numerical advantage, which was, decent enough. The North was better supplied with ammunition and materiel. The South had more cannon pieces, more cannons, field cannons, but they were older and they had, less gunpowder and cannonballs. The North had fewer artillery pieces, but they were better supplied with again gunpowder, cannonballs, and the other material that goes along with it. So the North was significantly superior in materiel, and again a 3-2 numerical advantage, plus not a huge advantage in cavalry, but decent enough. The North also had better supplies in terms of horse fodder and things like that. The logistical machine of the North was better, with better access to water and men under fighting conditions in the July heat. You need a lot of water there, otherwise it's tough to keep on keeping your troops in tip-top fighting condition. So they meet again. Now, the outcome of the battle was that the losses, depending on whose sources you look at, by the way, but the losses on either side were about the same. So, and I'll just use round numbers here, but 75,000 Confederates were fighting 100,000 Union troops. Again, these are just rounded numbers here. And yet the casualties, give or take, about 23 to 25,000 on each side. The casualties were about the same. So, but the Confederates decided to vacate the battlefield, and the North probably had the option of moving in more reinforcements and then making a chase on the Confederates. But really, General Meade, the Union general, was relatively cautious, but quite decently well organised. The guys seemed to be understanding what was going on. Some of the sub-commanders, particularly around the peripheral areas, around the hills and in the flanks, were reasonably quick to respond to threats. That was certainly made a difference, I think, in Gettysburg. Gettysburg could easily have gone the other way. If the Union Army had been flanked, as it almost was a couple of times, then it could have been a very decent victory for the Confederates, but they wouldn't have had the resources to follow up on it, and so the Union troops could have melted away without the army being destroyed necessarily. As it turned out, I see Gettysburg as a draw, neither side gaining really decisive victory at all. The Union could afford to lose resources and men, the Confederates couldn't. So when both sides are losing the same amount of men, then in the overall sense of military attrition, not only in men but also in materiel, then the North really, in the overall scheme of things, won from that. But was it a military battlefield victory? I wouldn't see it at that. The Confederates were prevented from winning, but it was not a victory. It was, again, a battlefield draw. And remember, we're talking 1863 here, and the Confederate troops were able to get away and fight again another day. And so in that sense, they somewhat achieved their objectives. But there was no decisive outcome for the Confederates. In terms of the Confederates seeking to convince the Union that the continued conflicts, continued warfare was a waste of time, look, don't bother anymore, just give us what we want and then it'll all be peaceful and harmonious again. The Gettysburg encouraged the North to say, no, we can persevere here, we can outlast these guys, in the end we can beat them. Not that there weren't voices of all persuasions, there were, but this was decisive in the sense that this was the first time that the Confederates were denied a victory and where casualties were inflicted on them, even though it was the same amount of casualties at the North, even though with a 3-2 numerical advantage, the North still couldn't inflict a decisive defeat on the Confederates, and with the materiel and all the resources they still couldn't beat them decisively. Even in spite of all that, the Confederate objectives were sufficiently frustrated and denied that it could be declared in the overall sort of geopolitical sense, it could be declared as Northern victory. Was it a battlefield victory? I would argue no, and I'll be interested to see your comments below. You've been with Tacitus today.